What happens when a group of restaurant workers mock a struggling customer only to discover the owner, someone with a past that will shock you, is silently watching everything unfold? This story will make you rethink the way we treat others. Stick around to see the unforgettable twist they never saw coming. Tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that will leave you speechless. Laughter filled the restaurant, loud and mean. It wasn't happy laughter. It sounded cruel, like someone enjoying another person's pain. A tired-looking man stood at the counter, his shoulders slouched as if he was carrying something heavy. His clothes were old but clean, his jacket looked thin for the cold outside, and his shoes were so worn out they looked ready to fall apart. In his hand, he held some crumpled cash and an old wallet. He stared at the menu above the counter, his eyes focused, trying not to notice the workers laughing at him. "Hey, nice shoes," said one of the workers, a tall, sharp-faced guy with a name tag that read Chris. His voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. "Are those from a museum? Looks like they're about 100 years old." Another worker, a short girl named Jenny, giggled awkwardly. "Maybe they're vintage," she said, trying to join in. "Retro is kind of cool, right?" But her smile didn't look real. She glanced at the man, her face showing a flicker of guilt before she looked away. Chris snickered, leaning on the counter. "Retro? Nah, those belong in the prehistoric section of a museum." The group burst into laughter again, their voices echoing around the small room. The man at the counter stayed calm. He didn't react, didn't even look up. His hands were steady as he pulled out a few bills from his wallet. "Just the soup and sandwich, please. No drink," he said quietly. His voice was steady, but it sounded like someone who was used to being treated this way, like he had learned to ignore it a long time ago. Chris rolled his eyes and punched in the order. "That'll be $8.50, he said, smirking. Then, after a pause, he added in a sarcastic voice, "Or maybe we should give you a discount, huh? Looks like you could use it." Jenny frowned and looked at him. "Chris, come on," she started, but the man interrupted her. "It's fine," he said, his tone calm but firm. He counted out his money carefully, placing it on the counter. His hands looked rough, like someone who worked hard for a living. For a moment he glanced up, and the look in his eyes made Chris hesitate. There was something strong in his gaze, something that made Chris falter, if only for a second. But then Chris grinned again, grabbed the money, and handed the man his receipt without saying anything else. The man stepped aside to wait for his food. Behind the counter, the workers started whispering and laughing again. They thought they were being quiet, but their voices weren't as low as they thought. Every so often, the laughter broke out loud enough to fill the room. The man stood there patiently, not saying a word. He took out his phone and looked at a message. It was short, just a few words. "Did you get dinner yet?" His lips pressed together tightly, but he didn't respond. He just put the phone back in his pocket. At a small table near the window, another man sat quietly, drinking coffee. He looked older, maybe in his 50s, wearing dark jeans and a simple sweater. He seemed like a regular customer, but there was something sharp in the way he watched the room. His eyes followed every movement, paying close attention to the workers behind the counter, especially Chris. He didn't say anything, but his face showed he wasn't happy about what he was seeing. The tired man at the counter stood still, his shoulders tense as he waited. Behind him, the workers kept laughing and whispering. Jenny glanced at him a few times, guilt flickering in her eyes, but she didn't say anything. Chris, on the other hand, kept joking, clearly enjoying himself. The man at the table near the window put his coffee down slowly and leaned back in his chair. His face stayed calm, but his eyes stayed locked on the scene, his expression growing colder by the second. The air in the restaurant grew thicker with tension, though it was clear most of it was lost on the workers behind the counter. They continued their whispered commentary, occasionally punctuated by bursts of laughter that felt louder than they were. Chris, emboldened by the silence of the man he had just ridiculed, leaned casually against the counter, his eyes still following the customer who stood a few feet away, staring at the order pickup area with quiet patience. Jenny, however, was beginning to squirm. She fidgeted with a tray, glancing nervously between Chris and the man. Her earlier guilt had deepened into something heavier, like an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. Her laugh had died long ago, replaced by a stiff silence as she stacked napkins in an attempt to avoid looking at the customer. Chris didn't seem to notice, or maybe he didn't care. "You think he's eating that here?" Chris whispered to her, tilting his head toward the man. "Bet you $5 he's taking it home to share with his pet rat." "Stop it, Chris," Jenny muttered under her breath, her voice barely audible over the faint clinking of dishes in the kitchen. "It's not funny." Chris raised an eyebrow at her, his grin widening. "Aw, come on, don't go soft on me now," he said, nudging her shoulder. "It's just a joke. Lighten up." But Jenny didn't respond. She pretended to busy herself by wiping down the counter, her movements stiff and mechanical. Her discomfort was becoming obvious, and Chris rolled his eyes, turning his attention to their third co-worker, Maggie, who had been silent up to this point. Maggie stood at the far end of the counter, her face unreadable as she stacked cups. "Maggie, back me up here," Chris said, smirking. "I mean, it's not like we're hurting anyone, right? The guy probably doesn't even understand half of what we're saying." Maggie didn't look at him. Instead, she straightened a stack of lids, her hands methodical and steady. After a long pause, she finally spoke, her voice low and measured. "Maybe he doesn't say anything because he's too tired to care." Her words cut through the air like a knife, and for a moment, Chris's smirk faltered. Jenny glanced at Maggie, her eyebrows lifting slightly in surprise. Chris, on the other hand, laughed it off, though there was an edge to his tone now. "Tired of what?" "Living," he joked, though the punchline fell flat. Even Jenny winced at that one. At the pickup counter, the man finally reached for his phone again. He tapped the screen once, reading something that made his shoulders sag just slightly. He hesitated for a moment before slipping the phone back into his pocket. His movements were slow, deliberate, like someone who had learned to conserve every ounce of energy. Unseen by the workers, the man sitting by the window had taken an even greater interest in what was happening. He shifted slightly in his chair, resting one elbow on the table as he tapped a finger thoughtfully against his coffee cup. There was something calculated in the way he observed the scene, his sharp gaze lingering on Chris's exaggerated gestures and Jenny's obvious discomfort. He noticed the small details, the way Jenny's hands shook slightly when she placed the tray on the counter, the way Maggie avoided looking directly at Chris, and the way Chris's laughter sounded forced now, like he was trying too hard to fill a silence that was becoming uncomfortable. The man at the window took another slow sip of coffee, his expression betraying nothing, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of something, contempt perhaps, or disappointment. He placed the cup down gently, the porcelain clinking softly against the table. Meanwhile, the customer's food order was finally ready. Jenny picked up the tray, hesitating for a moment before walking around the counter to hand it to him personally. Her steps were slow, and her face was flushed as she approached him. "Here you go," she said, her voice softer than before. "Sorry for the wait." The man glanced at her, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. There was no anger there, no resentment, just a quiet kind of exhaustion, the kind that came from years of being treated like he didn't belong. He nodded once, murmuring a polite, "Thank you," before taking the tray from her hands. Jenny's cheeks reddened further, and she opened her mouth as if to say something more, but Chris's voice interrupted her from behind. "Careful, Jenny," he called out, his tone dripping with mockery. "Don't catch whatever he's got." The words hung in the air like a bad smell, and for a moment everything went still. Jenny froze, her back stiffening as the customer lowered his eyes to the tray in his hands. Even Maggie stopped stacking cups, her hands pausing mid-motion as she glanced toward Chris with a look of quiet disapproval. From his seat near the window, the older man set his coffee cup down with deliberate slowness. He leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together on the table, his sharp gaze now fixed entirely on Chris. Though he still hadn't spoken a word, the intensity in his posture was impossible to ignore. Jenny turned back toward the counter, her jaw clenched, and Maggie let out a small sigh, shaking her head. The customer, however, didn't react. He simply turned and began walking toward the door, his steps steady but heavy, like someone carrying an invisible burden. As he reached the exit, he paused for a brief moment, glancing back over his shoulder. His eyes flickered toward the older man at the table by the window. The two men exchanged a brief glance, something unspoken passing between them in the silence. Then the customer pushed the door open and stepped out into the cold, leaving the warmth of the restaurant and the cutting laughter behind him. The door swung shut behind the man, leaving a faint jingle of the bell in its wake. For a moment, the restaurant seemed quieter, though the undercurrent of tension remained palpable. Jenny stood frozen near the counter, her hands gripping the edge of the tray she had handed off moments earlier. Her cheeks were still flushed, and her jaw was tight, as if she was fighting the urge to say something. Maggie kept her head down, quietly arranging the cups she had already stacked, though her lips pressed into a thin line. Chris, however, seemed entirely unfazed. "Man, what a character," Chris said with a laugh, leaning his elbows on the counter. "You'd think someone like that would know better than to come in here dressed like that. It's like they're asking for it." Jenny spun around suddenly, her eyes narrowing. "Asking for it?" she snapped, her voice sharper than it had been all evening. "He's just here to eat, Chris. What's your problem?" Chris blinked at her, his grin faltering briefly before he chuckled, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "Whoa, relax, Jenny. I'm just joking. You really need to lighten up." "It's not funny," Jenny said, her voice trembling slightly. "You don't know what he's going through. You don't know anything about him." Chris rolled his eyes, clearly unimpressed. "Come on, it's not that deep. People joke around all the time. It's not like I hurt him or anything." The guy didn't even react. "Maybe because he's used to it," Maggie said quietly, not looking up from the counter. Her voice was steady but cold, each word carefully chosen. "Maybe he's had to deal with people like you so often, he doesn't bother fighting back anymore." Chris turned to her, his grin now replaced by a slight sneer. "Oh, great. First, Jenny, now you? Are you seriously taking his side? You don't even know him." "And neither do you," Maggie replied, finally meeting his gaze. Her eyes were calm, but there was a quiet strength in them that made Chris falter again, if only for a second. But that didn't stop you from tearing him down anyway. The tension between them thickened, and for a moment the only sound in the restaurant was the faint hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. Chris opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, the sound of a chair scraping against the floor interrupted him. The older man, who had been sitting by the window, was now standing, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He picked up his coffee cup and saucer, carried them over to the counter, and placed them down gently. The action seemed simple enough, but there was a weight to it, as if every movement carried a silent message. His presence, which had gone largely unnoticed until now, suddenly felt impossible to ignore. Chris glanced at the man, his expression shifting uneasily. Hey," he said, forcing a smile. "Need a refill?" The older man didn't respond right away. He stood there for a moment, his hands resting on the counter, his gaze steady and unflinching. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost too calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "No," he said simply, "I don't need a refill." There was a pause, and in that silence, the atmosphere in the restaurant seemed to shift entirely. Jenny and Maggie exchanged uncertain glances, while Chris's grin wavered, though he tried to hold on to his usual cocky demeanor. The older man's gaze moved slowly, first to Jenny, then to Maggie, and finally to Chris. He studied each of them carefully, as if weighing something in his mind. Then he straightened up, sliding his hands into the pockets of his jacket. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, his voice still calm, but carrying a quiet authority that made Chris stiffen slightly. Chris blinked, caught off guard. No, should I?" he said, his grin now more nervous than confident. The man nodded slowly, as if he had expected that response. He glanced around the restaurant, his eyes lingering on the photos hanging on the wall, pictures of the restaurant's early days, its founding, and its gradual success. His gaze settled on one photo in particular, a younger version of himself, wearing an apron and standing proudly in front of the building on its opening day. Jenny's eyes widened slightly as she followed his gaze, realization dawning on her face. Maggie's hands froze mid-motion, and even Chris, slow as he was to pick up on cues, turned to glance at the photo, his face paling slightly as recognition began to sink in. The older man turned back to face them, his expression unreadable. "I'm the owner," he said simply, letting the words hang in the air. For a moment, no one said anything. Chris stared at him, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Jenny looked down, biting her lip, while Maggie quietly stepped back, her hands clasped in front of her. The owner didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. When he spoke again, his tone was firm but controlled, each word carrying the weight of someone who had seen more than his fair share of hardship. "I've been sitting here for the last 20 minutes, watching how you treated that man," he said, his eyes fixed on Chris. "I heard every word you said, every single one." Chris's face turned bright red, and he tried to stammer out a response. I didn't mean, it was just—" The owner held up a hand, silencing him instantly. "Save it," he said. "I've heard enough." The restaurant fell silent again, the air thick with tension and something else, something heavier. The owner turned his gaze to Jenny and Maggie, his expression softening slightly. "And the two of you," he said, his tone less harsh but no less serious. "You might not have joined in, but you didn't stop it either. Silence is just as loud as laughter in a situation like that." Jenny swallowed hard, her face turning pale. Maggie nodded once, her eyes downcast. The owner turned back to Chris, his expression hardening again. "You think it's funny to humiliate someone like that? To kick someone when they're already down? Is that what you think this place is about?" Chris opened his mouth again, but no sound came out. The owner didn't wait for an answer. "Because if that's what you think, you don't belong here." The words hit like a hammer, and the weight of them seemed to crush whatever bravado Chris had left. He looked down, his face burning with shame, as the older man stood tall, his presence commanding the room. The silence that followed felt louder than any words that could have been spoken. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, as the weight of the owner's words hung in the air. Chris shifted uncomfortably, his once cocky demeanor completely gone. He stared at the counter, unable to meet the older man's piercing gaze. Jenny looked down at her hands, twisting the hem of her apron anxiously, while Maggie stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the floor. The only sound in the restaurant was the faint hum of the refrigerator, a low background noise that seemed almost too loud in the tense atmosphere. The owner took a slow, deliberate step forward, his gaze still fixed on Chris. "I opened this place years ago," he said, his voice steady but laced with an unmistakable intensity. "Not because I wanted to make a fortune, but because I wanted to create a place where people could feel at home, where they'd be treated with respect, no matter who they were or what they looked like." His eyes flicked toward the photo on the wall, the one of him as a young man, smiling in front of the restaurant on its opening day. "When I started, I didn't have much," he continued. "Just a small loan, a lot of hope, and a pair of hands willing to work as hard as they needed to. There were days I couldn't afford more than a cup of coffee and a sandwich for myself. Days when people like that man out there," he gestured toward the door, "were the only ones who gave me the time of day." Chris finally looked up, his face pale, and his mouth set in a tight line. "I didn't mean," he started, but the owner cut him off with a sharp glance. "You didn't mean what?" the owner said, his tone cold now. "Didn't mean to laugh at someone struggling? Didn't mean to humiliate him in front of everyone in this room? Or didn't mean to get caught?" Chris flinched, the words hitting him like a slap. Jenny glanced at him out of the corner of her eye, her lips pressed together tightly, but she said nothing. Maggie shifted slightly, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. The owner let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing just slightly as he turned his attention to the two women. "Jenny, Maggie," he said, his voice softer, but still firm. "I know you weren't the ones leading this, but standing by and letting it happen isn't much better. You had the chance to say something, to step in, and you didn't. Why?" Jenny opened her mouth, but no words came out at first. She looked down at her hands, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her apron. Finally, she managed to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know what to say," she admitted, her cheeks flushing. "It all happened so fast, and You just what?" the owner interrupted, his voice sharp but not unkind. "Thought it was easier to stay quiet? Easier to let someone else take the blame while you stood back and watched?" Jenny's eyes filled with tears, and she quickly wiped them away, nodding. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I really am. I should have said something. I should have done something." The owner studied her for a moment before nodding slightly, his expression softening. "Apologies are a start," he said, "but they don't erase what happened. What matters now is what you do going forward." He turned to Maggie, who met his gaze with steady eyes. "And you?" he asked. "You didn't join in, but you didn't stop it either. Why?" Maggie hesitated for only a moment before answering, her voice calm and measured. "I didn't think it would make a difference," she said. "Chris was leading the charge, and honestly, I didn't think he'd listen to me. But you're right. That's no excuse. I should have spoken up." The owner nodded again, his expression thoughtful. "It's easy to go along with the crowd," he said. "Harder to stand up and do the right thing, especially when you think no one's watching. But someone is always watching. Whether it's a customer, a coworker, or even just yourself. You have to live with the choices you make." He turned back to Chris, his expression hardening once more. "And you," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "I don't think you understand what you've done. That man came in here looking for a meal, something simple, something he could afford, and you turned it into a spectacle. You made him feel small, like he didn't belong here. And for what? A cheap laugh to make yourself feel bigger?" Chris swallowed hard, his face flushed with shame. I wasn't thinking," he stammered. "I thought it was just a joke." "It wasn't a joke to him," the owner said sharply. "It was cruelty, plain and simple, and I won't have it in my restaurant." Chris looked down, his shoulders slumping. He opened his mouth to say something else, but the owner held up a hand, stopping him. "Enough," he said. "I've seen and heard enough for one day." The owner straightened, his gaze sweeping over all three of them. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "Jenny, Maggie, you're getting a warning. This is your chance to prove to me that you can do better, that you can be the kind of people this place deserves to have working here. Don't waste it." Jenny nodded quickly, tears still glistening in her eyes. Maggie simply inclined her head, her expression resolute. "And you," the owner said, turning back to Chris. His voice was colder now, his expression unreadable. "You're done. You don't belong here. Not in this restaurant, not with this team, and not representing what I've built." Chris's eyes widened in shock, and he started to protest. "Wait, you're firing me? You can't—" "I can," the owner interrupted firmly, "and I am." Chris looked like he wanted to argue, but the steel in the owner's gaze made him think twice. He swallowed hard, his face red with a mixture of anger and humiliation. Without another word, he turned and stormed toward the back of the restaurant, slamming the door behind him. The owner let out a slow breath, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. He turned back to Jenny and Maggie, his voice softer now. "You've got work to do," he said simply. "Don't let this happen again." The two women nodded, and as the owner walked back toward his table, the restaurant felt quieter than it had in a long time. But it wasn't the silence of tension or shame. It was the kind of quiet that comes after a storm, when the air is clear and everything feels just a little bit lighter. The restaurant settled into an uneasy calm after Chris's departure. Jenny and Maggie returned to their tasks, but the atmosphere had shifted. Their movements were more deliberate, quieter, as if they were treading on fragile ground. Neither spoke for a while, their earlier interactions replaced with thoughtful silence. The owner, now seated back at his table, quietly observed the scene. His coffee had grown cold, but he didn't seem to care. His eyes remained sharp, studying the way the two young women carried themselves in the aftermath. Jenny, still shaken, glanced toward the door where the man had exited earlier. Her stomach churned with guilt. "Do you think," she began, her voice trembling before trailing off. She paused, wiping her hands nervously on her apron. "Do you think he'll come back?" Maggie, who had been stacking utensils, looked up at her. "I don't know," she said simply. Her tone wasn't unkind, but there was a quiet finality to her words. Jenny swallowed hard, her eyes darting toward the owner as if seeking reassurance. She finally worked up the courage to speak louder, directing her words to him. "Do you think we should apologize? I mean, if he comes back?" The owner looked up from his table, his expression neutral but thoughtful. He took a moment before responding, his voice steady but tinged with a hint of sadness. "If he comes back, an apology is the least you owe him," he said. "But don't wait for him to give you the chance. The lesson isn't just about what you say to him, it's about what you do for everyone who walks through that door." Jenny nodded, her cheeks flushing again. She seemed to take the words to heart, her shoulders straightening slightly as she turned back to her work. Maggie set down the utensils she'd been stacking and crossed her arms, leaning against the counter. "You've dealt with this kind of thing before, haven't you?" she asked the owner, her voice quieter now. There was a note of curiosity in her tone, but also respect. The owner regarded her for a moment, then nodded. "I've been in his shoes," he said simply. "Probably more times than I can count." He gestured toward the photo on the wall, the younger version of himself smiling in front of the restaurant. "When I started out, I wasn't much better off than that man. I scraped together every penny I had just to keep this place running in the early days. I'd come home with holes in my shoes and just enough energy to collapse into bed, only to wake up and do it all over again." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting toward the window as he continued. "People like him? They're everywhere. They're the ones who work the hardest, the ones who keep places like this alive, buying the cheapest thing on the menu, leaving a tip they probably can't afford because they know what it's like to be on the other side of the counter. And too often they're the ones who get ignored, or worse, ridiculed." Jenny and Maggie both listened intently, the weight of his words settling over them. It was clear now that this wasn't just a story to him, it was a reminder of something deeply personal, something that had shaped the way he ran his business and the values he expected his staff to uphold. "What happened to Chris?" Maggie began, then hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Do you think it'll make a difference? Do you think he'll learn from it?" The owner let out a slow breath, his expression thoughtful. "That's up to him," he said. "Some people take moments like this and grow from them, others don't. But what matters is that the rest of you learn from it. Because if you don't, then it wasn't just Chris who failed, it was all of us." Jenny looked down at the counter, her fingers tracing an invisible pattern on the surface. "I won't forget," she said quietly. "I'll do better. I promise." The owner gave her a small nod, his expression softening slightly. "Good," Ewing said, "because running this place isn't just about serving food. It's about serving people. And if we can't do that with respect, then we're no better than the places that treat people like numbers." Before anyone could say anything else, the faint sound of the doorbell chimed, signaling a new customer. The three of them turned toward the entrance, and their expressions shifted when they saw who had walked in. It was the man from earlier, holding the same tattered wallet and wearing the same weary expression. His eyes scanned the room cautiously, as if bracing himself for what he might find. For a moment, he hesitated at the door, looking as though he might turn around and leave. But then his gaze met the owner's, and something in the older man's steady expression seemed to reassure him. He took a tentative step inside. Jenny's heart raced as she watched him approach the counter. She opened her mouth to speak but found herself at a loss for words. Maggie stepped forward instead, her voice steady but kind. "Welcome back," she said. "What can we get for you?" The man hesitated, glancing between the two women. His gaze lingered on Jenny for a moment, and she felt her cheeks burn with shame. But to her surprise, he offered a small, almost imperceptible nod before looking back at Maggie. "Just coffee," he said quietly. "To go." Jenny's hands trembled slightly as she reached for a cup, but she steadied herself, determined to do better this time. "Coming right up," she said, her voice soft but sincere. As the man waited, the owner stood from his table and approached the counter. The man looked up at him, his brow furrowing slightly, as if trying to place him. The owner smiled faintly, offering his hand. "I'm sorry for what happened earlier," he said. "It won't happen again." The man studied him for a moment, then shook his hand. "Thank you," he said simply. His voice carried no anger, just quiet gratitude. Jenny handed him his coffee, her hands steady now. "It's on the house," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "I'm sorry for earlier, really?" The man nodded again, taking the cup. "Thank you," he said, and this time there was the faintest hint of a smile on his face. As he left the restaurant, the doorbell chiming softly behind him, the room felt lighter. The tension that had hung over them all evening seemed to dissipate, replaced by something quieter, something that felt a little like hope. The door swung shut behind the man, the soft chime of the bell lingering in the air. The restaurant was silent for a moment, as if everyone inside was holding their breath. Jenny stood frozen behind the counter, her hand still gripping the coffee pot she had used to fill the man's cup. Maggie leaned slightly against the counter, her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the door as though expecting it to open again. The owner, now back at his table, watched them both closely, his expression unreadable. Finally, Jenny broke the silence. "Do you think he'll come back again?" she asked softly, her voice uncertain but hopeful. Maggie tilted her head thoughtfully. "Maybe," she said, "if he feels like it's different now, if he feels welcome." Jenny looked down, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I hope he does," she said after a pause. "I want the chance to show him that that I'm not like that." She swallowed hard, her cheeks flushing. "Not anymore." The owner stood and walked toward the counter, his movements calm and deliberate. He placed a hand on the edge of the counter, his steady presence commanding their attention. "It's not about whether he comes back," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It's about how you treat the next person who walks through that door, and the one after that." Jenny and Maggie both nodded, their expressions solemn. They seemed to understand now that this was bigger than one man or one incident. This was about a mindset, a choice to treat every customer, no matter who they were, with respect and dignity. The owner turned slightly, his gaze drifting back to the photo on the wall. "There was a time," he said, his tone softer now, "when I wasn't sure if I'd make it, when every penny mattered, and every unkind word cut a little deeper, because I was already struggling to keep my head above water." He paused, his eyes lingering on the younger version of himself in the photo. "I remember walking into places like this and feeling invisible, or worse, like I didn't belong. And I told myself, if I ever had the chance to create a place of my own, it would be different. It would be better." He turned back to Jenny and Maggie, his expression resolute. "That's what this place is supposed to be. Not just a restaurant, but a refuge. A place where someone like him," he nodded toward the door, can walk in and feel seen, feel respected, because sometimes that's all someone needs to get through the day. Jenny's eyes filled with tears again, but this time there was no shame in them, just quiet determination. "I won't forget," she said softly, echoing her earlier promise. "I'll do better." Maggie nodded in agreement. "Me too," she said. "This place should be what you built it to be." The owner studied them both for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Good," he said simply, "because from now on I'm going to be watching, not just as your boss, but as someone who cares about this place and what it stands for." He straightened, his presence as commanding as ever. "Now," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, "we've got work to do. Let's make sure the next person who walks through that door gets exactly what they came for and more." Jenny and Maggie exchanged a glance, their shoulders straightening as they nodded. They moved with renewed purpose now, their earlier nervousness replaced with a quiet confidence. Jenny picked up a tray and began wiping it down with careful precision, while Maggie busied herself restocking the utensils. The tension that had weighed them down earlier was gone, replaced by a sense of clarity and focus. As the evening wore on, the restaurant began to fill with the hum of quiet conversation and the clinking of dishes. Customers came and went, their orders taken with smiles that were now genuine. The energy in the room felt different, lighter, as though the earlier storm had cleared the air and left something fresh and new in its place. At one point, a young woman entered with a toddler on her hip, her face weary but kind. She approached the counter hesitantly, glancing around as if unsure of what to expect. Jenny greeted her with a warm smile, her voice steady and welcoming. "Hi there," she said. "What can I get for you today?" The woman hesitated for a moment, then smiled back, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Just a cup of coffee," she said, "and maybe a little something for him." She nodded toward the toddler, who was busy tugging at her sleeve. Jenny crouched slightly so she was eye level with the child, her smile widening. "What do you say, buddy? Want a cookie?" The toddler's eyes lit up, and he nodded enthusiastically, making both his mother and Jenny laugh. Maggie, watching from the side, stepped forward with a freshly baked cookie in hand, offering it with a kind smile. The owner, sitting back at his table, watched the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. He sipped from a fresh cup of coffee, his gaze sweeping over the restaurant. It wasn't perfect yet, there was still work to be done, but tonight had been a step in the right direction. As the young mother and her child left the restaurant, the toddler clutching his cookie like it was the greatest treasure in the world, the doorbell chimed softly. The sound seemed lighter now, almost musical, as it echoed through the room. Jenny and Maggie exchanged a small smile, the same thought passing between them. They were ready for the next customer, ready to do better. And this time, they wouldn't let anyone down. As the evening wore on, the hum of the restaurant settled into a steady rhythm. Customers came and went, their orders taken with a warmth that felt more genuine now. Jenny and Maggie worked in quiet sync, their movements precise and deliberate. Each interaction carried a sense of purpose, a subtle determination to restore what had been tarnished earlier. The owner remained seated at his table, his watchful eyes taking in every detail. He noticed how Maggie leaned in to speak with a shy teenager who seemed hesitant about ordering, her voice soft and encouraging as she helped him decide. He saw Jenny offer a refill to an elderly man before he even asked, her smile unforced and kind. Small gestures, but meaningful ones. They were learning, growing. He could see it. At one point, a young couple entered, their clothing modest and their hands clasped tightly together. They looked around nervously, as if unsure whether they belonged. Jenny greeted them warmly, her voice steady. "Welcome," she said, her smile genuine. "Take your time. We've got plenty of great options." The couple exchanged a glance, their unease softening. They approached the counter, hesitating as they looked at the menu. Maggie stepped forward this time, her tone reassuring. "Anything you need, just let us know," she said. "We're happy to help." The owner watched the exchange from his seat, his heart lifting slightly. It wasn't just about the words they were saying, it was the intention behind them. There was no trace of the dismissiveness or mockery that had soured the air earlier. The restaurant felt like his again. But there was still one piece left unfinished. The man who had walked out earlier lingered in the back of his mind. The owner had no way of knowing whether he would return, but the thought of leaving things unresolved gnawed at him. He stood slowly, his chair scraping softly against the floor, and walked over to the counter where Jenny was carefully organizing napkins. "Jenny," he said, his tone gentle but firm. She looked up immediately, her hands freezing mid-motion. "I need you to do something for me." "Of course," she said quickly, nodding. "Anything." He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. "If that man comes back, whether it's tomorrow, next week, or next year, I want you to remember tonight. I want you to show him that we've changed, that you've changed." Jenny nodded again, her expression serious. "I will," she promised. "I won't forget." The owner's gaze lingered on her for a moment, then he nodded. "Good," he said, "because people like him don't always get second chances. We owe it to him to make sure this place is what it's supposed to be." Jenny swallowed hard, her determination clear. "I understand," she said. "I won't let him down." Satisfied, the owner stepped back, his expression softening. "All right," he said, his voice lighter now. "Let's finish the night strong." The doorbell chimed one last time as the restaurant prepared to close for the night. The streets outside had grown quiet, the faint glow of streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement. A figure stepped inside, his presence almost ghost-like in the dim light. It was the man from earlier. Jenny saw him first, and her heart jumped into her throat. She froze for a moment, her hands gripping the counter as a flood of emotions washed over her. Guilt, relief, nervousness. But she steadied herself quickly, forcing her voice to remain calm. "Welcome back," she said, her words careful but warm. "It's good to see you." The man hesitated in the doorway, his expression cautious. He glanced around the room, his eyes landing on Maggie, who offered him a small nod and a quiet smile. Finally, his gaze shifted to the owner, who stood at his table with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. For a moment, no one moved. Then the owner stepped forward, his movements calm and deliberate. He approached the man with quiet confidence, stopping just a few feet away. "I'm glad you came back," he said simply. "We owe you an apology." The man's eyes flicked between the three of them, his expression softening slightly. "I wasn't planning to," he admitted, his voice low. "But I figured I'd give it one more chance." The owner nodded. "That's all I can ask," he said, "and I promise things will be different. They already are." Jenny stepped forward then, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I'm really sorry," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "For earlier? For everything. It wasn't right, and I want you to know I've learned from it. I'll do better." Maggie chimed in next, her tone calm but sincere. "Me too," she said. "We're not perfect, but we're trying." The man studied them both for a long moment, then glanced back at the owner. "And you?" he asked, his tone quiet but direct. The owner held his gaze, his expression steady. "I take responsibility," he said, "for everything that happened here today. It's my job to set the standard, and I failed. But I won't let it happen again. That's a promise." The man's lips twitched slightly, as though he was considering a smile but wasn't quite ready. "All right," he said after a pause. "We'll see." The owner extended his hand, and after a brief hesitation, the man took it. The handshake was firm but brief, a silent understanding passing between them. "Let me get you something," the owner said, stepping toward the counter. "On the house." The man hesitated, then nodded. "Just coffee," he said. "That's all I need." Jenny moved quickly, pouring the coffee with steady hands this time. She placed the cup on the counter with a small smile. "Here you go," she said softly. The man nodded his thanks, taking the cup and turning toward the door. He paused for a moment, glancing back at them over his shoulder. "Good luck," he said simply. Then he was gone, the doorbell chiming softly behind him. The three of them stood there for a moment, the air in the restaurant feeling lighter than it had all day. The owner let out a quiet breath, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Good work tonight," he said, his voice carrying a sense of calm pride. Jenny and Maggie exchanged a small smile, their relief evident. The restaurant was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now, peaceful, hopeful. And as they turned off the lights and locked the door, they knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of something better. As the restaurant's lights dimmed, it wasn't just another day ending, it was the start of a transformation. They had learned that kindness costs nothing but changes everything. Respect isn't earned, it's given freely, and in doing so, it makes the world lighter. If this story touched your heart, subscribe for more uplifting tales and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you.